Today we're continuing our worship series entitled Our Money Story, where we've been invited to explore money stories in the Bible, as well as the stories that we tell ourselves about money. We've been observing how these biblical money stories might shed some light onto our own spoken and unspoken stories. Today we will continue to wonder together, what is God's money story? We've remembered the relationship with the holy that invites us into the divine economy where there is enough for everyone and everyone is welcome at the table. Last week, we practiced release, exploring how living life with open hearts and open hands leads to life in abundance for all. This week, we are invited to reimagine. Our gospel passage for today comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 38 through 44. As he was teaching, he said, "Watch out for the legal experts. They like to walk around in long robes. They want to be greeted with honor in the markets. They long for places of honor in the synagogues and at banquets. They are the ones who cheat widows out of their homes and to show off they say long prayers. They will be judged most harshly." Jesus sat across from a collection box for the temple treasury and observed how the crowd gave their money. Many rich people were throwing in lots of money. One poor widow came forward and put in 2 small copper coins worth a penny. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I assure you that this poor widow has put in more than anyone else who's been putting money into the treasury." All of them were giving out of their spare change, but she, from her hopeless poverty, has given everything she had, even what she needed to live on. I've got to say that when I saw that the widow's mite was the passage for this week, I got a little anxious. Most of the time when I've heard this story told, particularly during stewardship time, it is clothed in piety, and oftentimes it comes strapped with a lot of shoulds. The woman gave from her poverty. This woman gave until it hurt. And as the story is often told, Jesus lifted her up as an example of what we all should be doing. Now, last week, Jesus did tell the young, wealthy man to sell everything and to give it all away. So this extreme generosity, this transformational release is not unheard of in the Gospels. And yet somehow, the story of this widow's last 2 coins feels very different to me from last week's story. This is not the story of a wealthy young man with a lot of possessions and a lot of options and so many different choices that he could make. This was a poor widow with only 2 tiny coins to her name. 2 lepta, the smallest Greek copper coin, worth 1/128th of a single day's pay. It feels like an insignificant, inconsequential amount, particularly tossed into this basket containing large sums of money that the wealthy worshipers were contributing. It was not even enough for her to live on for one day. And yet, to Jesus, her gift was anything but insignificant. This is an incredibly significant gift, the gift of her all. Jesus took notice, called over his disciples, and pointed out the significance of her gift. But this week, I've been wondering, what exactly was the significance that Jesus was pointing to? The context gives us some pretty good clues, clues that it seems are often overlooked in the way that we've typically heard this woman's story told. Just before Jesus noticed this woman putting in her last 2 coins, Jesus had warned, beware of legal experts, teachers, scribes who go about in their fancy robes with their exquisite stoles as long as their eloquent, fancy, flowery prayers, all the while devouring the home of the widow. And then immediately after this, Jesus pointed to a widow who had just given everything, all that she had, which isn't even enough for her to survive on for one day. The wealthy were also walking by and tossing in large sums of money into the temple coffers as the religious experts were preparing to say their prayers. Does it seem that perhaps rather than pointing out the piety of this woman, that Jesus could be calling out the hypocrisy of temple leadership and wealthy worshipers who were blind to the needs of this poor widow in their midst? Perhaps instead of holding this woman up as an example of virtue, Jesus was inviting the disciples to reimagine an economy and a faith practice in which there wouldn't be such disparity. What is wrong with this picture? There are lots and lots of people with lots and lots of money to toss into the coffers, going to hear prayers and teachings from the scribes and religious leaders who should know full well the mandate repeated over and over and over again in the scriptures that you are to care for the widow, the orphan, the foreigner among you. Perhaps Jesus was calling attention to this scene not to celebrate the giving of her last 2 coins, but to condemn the system that created such extremes of haves and have-nots in the first place. The exegetical work of Addison G. Wright was a gift to me this week that helped me to reimagine this story. Wright argues that in both Mark and Luke, Jesus condemns those scribes who devour the houses of widows and then follows immediately the story of a widow whose house has been, beyond doubt, just been devoured. What other words would be more appropriate to describe it? She put in everything she had, her whole living. Her religious thinking accomplished the very thing that the scribes were accused of doing. If indeed Jesus is opposed to the devouring of widows' houses, how could he possibly be pleased with what he sees here? It would seem that the only way out of these acute difficulties is quite simply to see Jesus' attitude to the widow's gift as downright disapproval and not as approbation. The story does not provide a pious contrast to the conduct of the scribes in the preceding section, as is the customary view. Rather, it provides a further illustration of the ills of official devotion. Wow. This reimagining makes the scene look very, very different. From this vantage, it looks a lot more like that little poor old lady encouraged to experience blessing by giving sacrificially from her Social Security check to the televangelist who puts on a big fancy production and lives an extravagant lifestyle while the widow struggles to make ends meet. In our gospel passage today, the widow didn't give until it hurt. She was already hurting at the hands of the system that just wasn't holding up its end of the deal. The religious leaders, as scholars of the scriptures and the law, should have known better. And the wealthy worshipers under their leadership didn't seem to notice her pain or think that her situation had anything to do with them. The legal experts know the law. They've studied the Torah and they know it inside and out, which means that they know how important it is in God's covenant to care for the widow, to care for the poor and the immigrant. They knew the divine vision laid out in the scriptures with laws to make real a divine economy in which there is enough for everyone and everybody's needs are met. Care for the poor is a vital part of the covenant. We love God by loving our neighbors. Our relationship with the holy looks a whole lot like our relationship to the community around us. Leviticus 19, 9 through 10 says, "When you harvest your land's produce, you must not harvest all the way to the edge of your field, and don't gather up every remaining bit of your harvest. Also, do not pick your vineyard clean or gather up the grapes that have fallen there. Leave these items for the poor and the immigrant. I am the Lord your God." And then in Leviticus 25, 8 through 12, it reads, "Count off 7 weeks of years, that is 7 times 7, so that the 7 weeks of years totals 49 years. Then have the trumpet blown on the 10th day of the 7th month. Have the trumpet blown throughout your land on the day of reconciliation. You will make the 50th year holy, proclaiming freedom throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It will be a jubilee year for you. Each of you must return to your family property and to your extended family. The 50th year will be a jubilee year for you. Do not plant, do not harvest the secondary growth, and do not gather from the freely growing vines, because it is a jubilee. It will be holy for you." The Jewish practice of a jubilee year invites us to imagine leaving the edge of the harvest for the poor and the immigrant to reap. In the 50th year, the harvest is shared and disparities are rebalanced. In looking at the passages from Leviticus and Deuteronomy these past couple of weeks, that contain lots of details and lots of specifics, and it can be confusing, and it's tempting to say, what do these little details of ancient law mean? And why do they matter to us? But as I've been sitting with these passages, what seems to be bubbling to the surface for me is that these laws were meant to keep things in balance for the long run. These laws were meant so that a community would be sustainable, that the community would remain in balance over generations, and there would not become extreme differences between the haves and the have-nots. We can see evidence of this generational disparity in our own context. Someone gets behind due to medical issues or a job loss, an emergency, or a death in the family. And these economic problems can have life-altering consequences that can set a life on a trajectory that can impact generations. And this says nothing to the system of injustice in which the deck has been stacked against groups of people for hundreds of years. How might we begin to imagine a world set in a divine economy of balance and enough for all? To reimagine means to imagine again. To imagine means to form a mental picture of something. Even imagining a world like this can be difficult for us. To imagine can also mean to believe something is probably true, even though there may be real-world evidence to the contrary. To imagine is a creative act. We hear these things about a divine reset, about rest for all of creation and enough for everyone. And it seems so contrary to what we witness and experience in our world. Jesus invited the disciples to take notice and to witness the widow's gift, a gift that shined a light on the disparity and contrast between the reality of the first century economy in the Roman Empire and the image of the divine economy. I wonder if he pointed this out to the disciples so that he might invite the disciples to join him in imagining something new. God's divine economy provides such a different image of reality. As I've been reading from Deuteronomy and Leviticus these past couple of weeks, God's vision for community seems to understand that things happen. People fall upon hard times. Maybe people have to sell their land because they don't see any other way through. But when we look at the concept of Jubilee, that selling was never intended to be permanent. Balance was meant to be restored. God's vision doesn't allow taking advantage of each other. The Israelites were not to see the hard times of their neighbor as an opportunity to grow their own wealth. And it wouldn't matter anyway, because debts were forgiven every 7 years in the Sabbath year, and all would be reset in the year of Jubilee. In fact, Leviticus 25, God says the land must not be permanently sold because the land is mine. You are just immigrants and foreign guests of mine. That's powerful. We don't own this. We are guests. As technical and strange as many of these ancient laws seem to us, the message from the Hebrew Scriptures feels so relevant in our current context. We are confronted with many examples of this right now. I have read a lot of articles lately about how during the pandemic, these disparities have grown. During the pandemic, those who have been able to increase their wealth, while those who struggle are deeper in the hole than ever before. Large corporations are experiencing record earnings, while local small businesses are struggling to keep their doors open, and many have not been able to do that. Those who live paycheck to paycheck, barely getting by during the good times, have now seen their places of employment closed or their hours cut back. Many have had to make difficult decisions to stay home with children during online school. And they will be paying the financial consequences of this time for years to come. We also see educational gaps widening. Families with enough resources are able to provide the technology and the tutors that their kids need to thrive during this disruptive season, while many of the most vulnerable students are falling through the cracks. How might our bearing witness to these realities prompt us to reimagine our story? How might we participate in the creative act of reimagining a new story that is more in line with God's story? As I've been sitting with these questions this week, I've been thinking that perhaps we participate in reimagining when we work together, when we partner with and support groups and organizations in our communities that are doing the work that cares for the most vulnerable, the work of welcoming the stranger, and the work for justice. We begin to engage in reimagining when we broaden our circle, We listen to the voices of those on the margins, and we begin to see the creativity and the wisdom possessed by those who for far too long have been silenced or excluded from the discussion. Like practicing release, reimagining is not a one and done. It is an ongoing process. In our chapter for book group this week, Richard Rohr, in his book, The Wisdom Pattern, said that God has no grandchildren, only children, and that each generation has their own work to do in the co-creative process of reimagining that leads to resurrection and rebirth. So, what part of our story needs reimagining? How might we reimagine to find hope and joy and enough? How might we sound the trumpet, proclaiming freedom throughout the land to all of its inhabitants? How might Holy Jubilee be inviting us to reimagine?